Chapter 10 of the History and Literature of the Early Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Eric Hansen. The History and Literature of the Early Church by James Orr. Chapter 10. The Age of the Great Persecutions, Victory of Christianity, A.D. 250 to 324. It is a curious coincidence that the completion of Rome's millennium should also mark the beginning of its downfall. The Gothic invasions had commenced even in the reign of Philip. In that of Decius, A.D. 250 to 51, they spread frightful desolation through Rome's fairest provinces. The turning point in the history of the Church is not less marked. Everything seemed going prosperously. It appeared as if an easy and peaceful victory were about to be achieved. But observant eyes, like Origen's, saw that this season of respite was only the calm before the storm of a great final struggle. The breaking of that storm was not long deferred. Hitherto, there had been severe and distressing persecutions, but they had been more or less local and limited in range. Now, the empire woke up to see that the very existence of paganism was at stake. And for the first time, we have systematically planned and strictly universal persecutions. Point 1. The Decian and Valerian persecutions. The Emperor Decius was a Roman of the old school. His 2 years' reign ended in a defeat by the Goths, in which he and his army perished miserably in a morass. But they were years fraught with important consequences for the Christians. Decius was a persecutor, not from impulse, but from settled policy. He honestly believed that the salvation of Rome lay in its old institutions, and that Christianity, as a rival power, could not be too speedily or effectually crushed. He is credited with the saying that he would rather have a second emperor at his side than the Bishop of Rome. He was, therefore, scarcely established in the empire when he launched the edict which inaugurated what is deemed the seventh persecution, A.D. 250. He does not seem at first to have desired the death of the Christians. His policy was to terrify them by citing them before the tribunals and requiring them to recant. Then, if they proved obstinate, to coerce them by imprisonments, confiscation, tortures, exile. It was only when these measures failed that the extremist tortures and death were inflicted on confessors, and especially on the bishops. The persecuting edict was sent throughout the empire and rigorously enforced. Christians who did not appear before the tribunals on an appointed day were to be sought after and brought before a commission composed of the magistrate and 5 of the principal citizens. The edict fell like a thunderbolt on the church. The epistles of Cyprian, his treatise on the lapsed, and a letter of Dionysius of Alexandria give us vivid pictures of the persecution, but show also how ill-prepared the church was to meet it. Multitudes in time of peace had joined the church who had no deep-rooted piety, and these, especially the wealthier classes, now fell away in large numbers. Dionysius pictures them approaching the altar, pale and trembling, as if they were going to be sacrificed instead of to sacrifice, while the populace who thronged around jeered them. Special names had to be invented to designate the classes of the lapsed. sacrificati, those who had sacrificed, horrificati, those who offered incense, libellitici, those who for payment obtained a certificate that they had sacrificed, though they had not done so, and acta facientes, those who without certificates pretended they had sacrificed. Many, however, did not apostatize, but submitted to be tormented with heat, hunger, and thirst in their prisons, stretched on the rack, torn with hooks, burnt with fire, and finally put to death. One of the first victims of the persecution was the aged Fabian, Bishop of Rome. For more than a year after this, no Bishop of Rome could be elected. Other distinguished sufferers were Babylos of Antioch and Alexander of Jerusalem, Origen's friend. Origen himself, it will be remembered, was imprisoned and tortured. The death of the emperor set him free. The persecution broke out again under his successor, Gallus, AD 251-54. It is, however, under the more important reign of the next emperor, Valerian, AD 254-60, that we come to what is usually numbered as the eighth persecution. Valerian was a man of unblemished virtue, and for the first 4 years of his reign was not unfavorably disposed toward the Christians. His house is described by Dionysius as filled with pious persons and a church of God. Eusebius 6:36. The change seems to have been brought about by a dark-minded man, Macrianus, who had acquired great influence over him. The reign of Valerian was the most calamitous the empire had yet experienced. This also had doubtless its effect. The persecution that ensued exceeded even that of Decius in severity. Its first stage was in AD 257, and went no farther than to remove bishops from their churches, and forbid Christian assemblies on pain of death. The second stage, AD 258, was far more drastic, decreeing that office-bearers of churches should immediately be put to death, persons of rank should be degraded, and, if they persevered, should be put to death. Noble women and persons of lesser rank should suffer confiscation and banishment. One of the first to suffer was again the Bishop of Rome, Sixtus, who was beheaded in his episcopal chair. We saw that Cyprian suffered in this persecution. In Spain, we read of a bishop and 2 deacons being burned alive in the amphitheater. The persecution came to an end with the captivity of Valerian in Persia, AD 260. How little all these persecuting edicts had done to destroy Christianity is shown by the fact that the first step of his frivolous son and colleague, Gallienus, AD 254-68, was to restore to congregations their right to worship, and give bishops permission to return to their charges. Christianity thus became once more practically a religio licita. Point 2. Effects of the persecutions. Schisms of Felicissimus and Novatian. A delicate and difficult question for the Church, as soon as the severity of the persecutions had abated, was the restoration of the lapsed. These formed a wide class, and among them were included many shades and degrees of guilt. Multitudes had little real sense of their sin and apostasy, and were indisposed to brook delay in restoration. The evil was aggravated by faction, and by a practice which had grown up of allowing confessors a right of intercession for the fallen, and even of granting certificates of peace with the church. In Carthage especially, this privilege was abused beyond all bounds. The result was two schisms, one at Carthage, the other at Rome, the latter of which, at least, had important historical consequences. Cyprian's views on the restoration of the lapsed tended to strictness. He was, at any rate, opposed to action, till a council could be called to settle deliberately terms of readmission. It will be remembered that a party of opposition to Cyprian existed in Carthage, the result of jealousy at his ordination. The head of this party was a presbyter, Novatus, who had already shown his disregard for Cyprian by ordaining one Fedicissimus as his deacon. These threw in their influence with the advocates of lenity, and received back all and sundry to church fellowship. Novatus shortly after went to Rome, where we find him assuming the opposite role of a leader of the strict party. Cyprian gradually softened in his views, but without effect on the opposition. Felicissimus openly revolted against his authority, and refused to receive a delegation which Cyprian had sent to inquire into the necessities of sufferers by the persecution. At a council held in AD 251, Felicissimus was condemned, and at a second council, AD 252, milder rules were adopted. The party of Felicissimus now set up a bishop of their own, named Fortunatus, and the schism was complete. It seems to have had no permanent success. At Rome, a much graver contest was being waged. Cornelius, the bishop-elect, was opposed by Novatian, a man of somber temper and rigorous principles, who resisted all readmission of the lapsed to church communion. He did not deny that the penitent might receive mercy from God, but held that the church had no power to grant it. Novatus, from Carthage, threw himself into this new strife, and, on the rejection of Novatian, persuaded his party not to accept Cornelius as their bishop, but to elect a bishop for themselves. Novatian was chosen opposition bishop, and a rival church was formed which developed into a great organization, spread into many countries, Gaul, Africa, Asia Minor, etc., and continued for centuries, with a great reputation for piety. Epiphanius, e.g., mentions that in Thyatira there were no Catholics for 112 years. Novatian was a genuinely able and learned man, as his work on the Trinity shows. Following on the schisms, embittered disputes arose on the rebaptism of heretics. These, as formerly mentioned, brought Cyprian into collision with Stephen, Bishop of Rome, AD 255-56. Cyprian, with the North African Church, took the stricter view, insisting on rebaptism. Stephen took the milder. The more charitable view ultimately prevailed. Point 3. Empire and Church till Diocletian. Neoplatonism. The death of Gallienus in AD 268 left the empire in a state bordering on ruin. From this period, a rapid succession of emperors held sway, whose main task it was to clear the provinces from the barbarians that infested them. They were mostly men of obscure rank, of Illyrian extraction, hence known as the Illyrian emperors, and of great bravery and skill. The only one that need be mentioned here was Aurelian, AD 270 to 75, who achieved a series of brilliant triumphs in East and West, but made himself odious by his pride and severity. He was zealous for the maintenance of pagan rites, was himself a devoted worshipper of the sun, and was on the point of subscribing an edict for the persecution of the Christians when he was cut off by conspirators. Some allege that the edict was actually issued. It is this, nevertheless, which is reckoned as the 9th persecution. A persecution, it will be seen, only on paper. The murder of the Emperor Numerian in AD 284 opened the way for Diocletian, with whom a new era in the empire begins. During all this period, apart from the danger under Aurelian, as well as during the first 19 years of the reign of Diocletian, till AD 303, the Church enjoyed peace. This is known as the 40 Years' Peace, and while it lasted, the Church continued to grow in numbers, wealth, and influence, but also in worldliness and corruption. Large and magnificent churches began to be erected. Greater splendor was introduced into the services. Church offices were multiplied, etc. Christians were found in the highest positions in the palace. In the same proportion, church discipline was relaxed, and the old evils from which the Decian persecution had done much to purify the church returned in full tide. Reference may be made here to a new form of opposition which had sprung up on the philosophical and literary side, namely Neoplatonism. This philosophical form of faith, while bitterly hostile to Christianity, is the strongest testimony to its influence. It no longer poured unqualified ridicule on Christianity, as Celsus had done, but dealt with it in an eclectic spirit, condemning only its exclusive claims. "We must not," said Porphyry, "calumniate Christ, but only pity those who worship him as God." The founder of this school, Ammonius Saccas of Alexandria, died AD 243, was born of Christian parents, and indeed, for a time himself professed Christianity. A trace of Christian influence may be seen in the Neoplatonic doctrine of the Trinity, which, however, has little in common with the Christian, but is wrought up from Platonic elements. The problem, which Neoplatonism set itself to solve, was the union of the finite and infinite, and its means of bridging the opposition of the two was ecstasy. The most illustrious teachers of the school after Ammonius were Plotinus, died about AD 270, and Porphyry, died AD 304. Porphyry wrote a book called Discourses Against the Christians, of which fragments are preserved in the Fathers who replied to it. Some of his objections to the books of Scripture, e.g. to the book of Daniel, anticipate modern critical attacks. A literary opponent of a coarser stamp, generally reckoned to this school, was Hierocles, prefect of Bithynia, afterwards of Alexandria, a cruel persecutor of the Christians. His book, Truth-Loving Words to the Christians, attempts to disparage the character and miracles of Jesus by comparison with those of Aristeas, Pythagoras, and the pagan miracle worker Apollonius of Tyana. Eusebius wrote a reply to it. The school afterwards degenerated into theurgy and magic, e.g. Jamblichus, of Chelseas, who died about AD 330. Its last famous teacher was Proclus of Constantinople, the commentator on Plato, died AD 485. Point 4. The Diocletian persecution. The last and most violent of all the persecutions that overtook the Christians, the 10th persecution, was that in the reign of Diocletian, AD 303 to 13. Diocletian, the son of a slave, introduced changes into the organization of the empire of far-reaching importance. He assumed personally the style of an oriental despot, divided the empire into two parts, west and east, with an Augustus for each, changed the seat of empire from Rome to the new capitals, Milan, west, and Nicomedia, east. Further, subdivided the empire by associating with each Augustus a Caesar, who was, in due course, to succeed to the higher dignity. In pursuance of these arrangements, Diocletian, east, associated with himself, in AD 286, Maximian, a rude but able soldier, west, and in AD 292 added, as the two Caesars, Galerius, originally a herdsman, and Constantius Chlorus, father of Constantine the Great. To consolidate the relations, Constantius was required to put away his wife Helena, mother of Constantine, and become son-in-law of Maximian, while Galerius became the son-in-law of Diocletian. Constantius received the rule of Gaul and Britain, and Galerius had Illyria. If Diocletian did not molest the Christians during the first 19 years of his reign, his own wife Prisca and daughter Valeria were reputed Christians, it was not from any love of their religion. But Diocletian was a wary, politic man, and knew better than most what a conflict with Christianity, which was to end in its suppression, would mean. The real instigator of the persecution was the low-bred, ferocious Galerius. Diocletian long held back, but, plied with arguments by Galerius and the pagan nobles, he at length gave way, and a persecution was agreed on, to take effect on the 23rd of February, AD 303. There was to be no halting or turning back, but measures were to be taken for the entire suppression of Christianity. Proceedings began at daybreak on the day named by the demolition of the magnificent church at Nicomedia, one of the architectural ornaments of the city, and the burning of all copies of the scriptures found in it. Next day, an edict was issued giving the signal for a general persecution. All churches were to be demolished. All copies of the scriptures were to be burned. Christians holding official positions were to be degraded and deprived of civil rights. Others were to be reduced to the condition of slaves. Slaves were made incapable of receiving their freedom. The first edict, AD 303, was aimed, it will be observed, rather at the churches and the scriptures, a new policy, than the persons of the Christians. Disobedience was punished by degradation, not by death. A second edict, AD 303, ordered all clergy, without option of sacrifice, to be thrown into prison. Some time after, a third edict was issued, yet more severe. The clergy in prison were required to sacrifice. If they did not, they were to be compelled by every means of torture. Finally, in AD 304, a fourth edict extended this law to the whole body of the Christians. The most fearful tortures were inflicted on the Christians to compel them to submit. And though death was not mentioned in the edict, it was, as we see from Eusebius, freely inflicted. The sweeping severity of this persecution is apparent from the rehearsal of these edicts alone. Their publication, as in the Decian persecution, caused indescribable consternation. Immediately on the publication of the first, a soldier rashly tore it down, with opprobrious words. For this act he was roasted over a slow fire. Fires that broke out in the palace were blamed on the Christians, and led to many being burned, beheaded, and drowned. Formerly trusted chamberlains of the palace were put to death. Diocletian's own wife and daughters had to clear themselves by sacrifice. Special panic was created by the order for the surrender and destruction of the sacred scriptures. The scenes of the Decian persecution were repeated in new forms. Multitudes hastened at once to give up their copies of the scriptures. Some palmed off on the officers worthless and heretical writings. Others, more enthusiastic, not only retained their scriptures, but boasted of their possession, and challenged the magistrates to do their worst. Those who for any reason gave up their scriptures were branded with the name traditores, and the antagonism to these afterwards gave rise to a new schism, that of the Donatists. See below. The later edicts still further tried the faith and patience of the Christians. In Gaul and Britain, first under Constantius, then under Constantine, the Christians enjoyed comparative peace. But throughout the rest of the empire, the persecution raged with dreadful cruelty. Egypt and Palestine were specially afflicted. In AD 305, Diocletian abdicated, but this rather made matters worse for the Christians. Galerius, the chief promoter of the persecution, was now emperor, and his creatures, Severus and Maximin, in west and east respectively, were entirely devoted to his interests. The revolt of Maxentius in Italy, AD 306, was favorable to the Christians insofar as it was his interest to attach them to his side. And with the defeat of Maxentius by Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, AD 312, see below, persecution in the west may be said to have ended. In the east, under the savage Maximin, it went on with intensified severity till AD 311, when a welcome relief came. In that year, the arch-persecutor, Galerius, smitten with a dreadful internal disease, was moved to make peace with the Christians, and issued an edict of toleration, granting full liberty of opinion and worship. This was followed in AD 313, after a provisional edict in AD 312, by the famous Edict of Milan of Constantine and Licinius. See below. Maximin himself, defeated by Licinius, likewise issued an epistle in which he granted full liberty of worship. One reason he gives for the persecution is that the emperors had seen that almost all men were abandoning the worship of the gods and attaching themselves to the party of the Christians. Eusebius 9:9. Thus, on every hand, the persecution was admitted to have failed, and Christianity emerged triumphant. Point 5. Career and character of Constantine. Victory of Christianity. To judge fairly of Constantine, distinction should be made between the period before he arrived at supreme power and the period that succeeded. In the early period, his character and conduct stand before us in a most favorable light. The son of Constantius Chlorus and Helena, said to be the daughter of an innkeeper, he was born at Nisus, in Dacia, probably in AD 274. After his mother's divorce, he continued to reside at Nicomedia as a hostage for his father's loyalty. He joined his father in Gaul in AD 305, and was proclaimed emperor by the troops in Britain on the death of Constantius in AD 306. Galerius, however, only granted him the rank of Caesar. At the courts of Diocletian and Galerius, he seems to have been a general favorite. His high reputation was maintained in Britain and in Gaul. He was tall and commanding in appearance, affable in manners, just and tolerant in his rule, pure in his personal morals. He was a man undoubtedly of large ambitions, but these rested on a conscious ability to rule. From the first, he was a protector of the Christians, and, as he sped on from victory to victory in their interests, it is perhaps not wonderful that in their eyes, and in his own, he should come to be regarded as a sort of second Cyrus, a special instrument raised up by God for the deliverance of his church. In AD 306, Maxentius, the son of Maximian, had, with his father, usurped the supreme power in Italy. His reign was one of intolerable oppression. A historical battle was fought between Constantine and Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, about 9 miles from Rome, AD 312, which issued in the defeat and drowning of the latter. It was on the march to this battle that Constantine had his famous vision of the cross, which some speak of as his conversion. He saw, or believed he saw, a cross in the sky, above the brightness of the sun, bearing on it the words, "By this, conquer." The same night Christ appeared to him in sleep, and directed him to make a standard of like pattern, which should be to him a token of victory. There is nothing improbable in the supposition that the emperor may have seen an appearance in the heavens, which his excited imagination construed into a cross, or that in the agitation of his mind, on the eve of so critical a contest, he may have had such a dream as he describes. If his mind was already pondering the question of the acceptance of Christianity, this becomes the more probable. The sacred standard, the labarum, was at least made, and the monogram of Christ was displayed on shields and helmets of soldiers and on gems and coins. Even yet, however, Constantine was very dimly instructed in the real nature of Christianity. Christianity, indeed, was never much more to him than a system of monotheism and providence. The Roman world was now divided between Constantine and Licinius, and Augustus of Galerius, and the final struggle could not be long delayed. In AD 313, the two emperors issued jointly the Edict of Milan, already mentioned. In AD 314, 2 battles were fought, in which Licinius was worsted. A truce of 8 years followed. In this interval, the mind of Constantine was clearing, and not a few of his laws show a Christian impress. Licinius, on the other hand, took the side of paganism, and the last war, in AD 323, was avowedly waged in the interests of the old religion and the old gods. "The issue of this war," said Licinius, must settle the question between his god and our gods. The decisive victory at Hadrianople, AD 323, therefore, was well understood to be a victory for Christianity. In the following year, AD 324, the Christian religion was established. The nature of this settlement, and some of the later events of Constantine's reign, on which dark shadows rest, are touched on in the next chapter. Point 6. The Donatist Schism. Even before arriving at full power, Constantine had been asked to adjudicate in an ecclesiastical dispute arising out of the persecution in Carthage. Mensurius, bishop of Carthage, had given offense to the stricter party by evasive conduct when called on to surrender his scriptures, and in other ways. They could accomplish nothing in his lifetime. But when his successor, Caecilian, was elected, in AD 311, they broke out in revolt under the leadership of one Donatus, accused Caecilian of having been ordained by a traditor, Felix, and, at a synod attended by 70 bishops, set up a rival bishop in the person of Majorinus. Appeal was made by the Donatists to Constantine to have the question determined whether Felix was really a traditor, and a series of investigations were held, AD 313-16, including one by the Council of Arles, AD 314, and a final inquiry by the emperor himself, AD 316, all with the same result of clearing Felix and upholding Caecilian. Majorinus died in AD 315, and was succeeded as bishop by a second and greater Donatus, from whom the sect specially takes its name. Donatus proved utterly irreconcilable, and Constantine was provoked to order the party into banishment. This edict he recalled next year, AD 317. Donatism continued to spread, and by the end of Constantine's reign, was able to summon a synod of 270 bishops. It became a rallying point for all the forces of discontent in the district, and gave rise to outrageous manifestation in the roaming bodies of circumcellions, translated to round the cottages, whose violence spread terror through the country. The better Donatists, of course, repudiated these abuses. The party was still powerful in the days of Augustine, 5th century. Points for inquiry and study. Make a picture of the state of the church in the Decian persecution from Cyprian's letters. Read the letter of Dionysius of Alexandria. Study the evidences of the large numbers and social rank of the Christians in this period, or compare the different estimates of the character of Constantine. Illustrate the Diocletian persecution from Eusebius. Books. For history, see Gibbon. Stanley's Eastern Church. Biggs, Platonists of Alexandria. Constantine the Great in Home Library. End of Chapter 10.